In January 1945, Germany was poised to reap the whirlwind as Allied forces to west and east prepared to tear into the heartland of the Reich. The German army was on the defensive, having lost the Battle of the Bulge, and Allied armies stood on the borders of Germany itself. They had yet to penetrate the home territory of the Reich, but senior commanders, notably Heinz Guderian, knew that this was the calm before the storm. When the Allies decided to attack, he knew there would be no way that Germany could be saved. The Allies were still extremely wary of the Nazis. In the Ardennes, the massive German attack had recently succeeded in wiping out 1/10 of all American and British army. The American newsreels were warning their forces in propaganda films that the Nazi beast had not yet been destroyed. To the east, the Russians were struggling to wrest control of Budapest in one of the most bitter of all struggles of World War II. A huge push by an SS Panzer Army was attempting to break the siege of Hungary's capital. Further north, the Red Army's offensive of the previous year had been halted on the east bank of the Vistula before Warsaw. In Germany, Goebbels' propaganda machine was working at full throttle. German morale had received a huge shot in the arm from the Ardennes counterblast, coming as it did at the end of a year of calamities for the Reich. Newsreels exhorted the population to renewed and continual sacrifices. For the defense of the homeland, the very old and very young were called upon to place themselves in the path of the Allied onslaught. These volunteers were supplied with the one-shot Panzerfaust bazooka, but little else. Their soldiers were stiffened by images in the theaters of revenge that the Russians were exacting on the Germans as they advanced westwards. The previous November, a German counterattack had regained the little town of Neumersdorf to find the place in ruins and the entire population massacred. This grisly harbinger bore out all Goebbels' most blood-curdling prophecies. Most of the poorly trained Volkssturm People's Storm units didn't get the chance to use their weapons. Many broke and fled when faced with the horror of a real battle. Goebbels, almost alone among Hitler's henchmen, faced the German population in public meetings. He asked them to hold out against the Allied air raids, to maintain faith in the Führer, whose wonder weapons would surely deliver Germany even now. Goebbels' diary entries show that he did not believe his speeches. Spin could not alter the harsh reality. Lies could not put more troops in the field or more tanks in front of the Soviet armored fleets. Germany was in her death throes. She was being swamped by the machinery that her opponents fielded. German industry had failed to adopt the processes of mass production. To east and west, the Allied factories churned out equipment at a ratio to the Germans of 10 to 1. German industry was collapsing under the weight of Anglo-American bombing, which Reich Armaments Minister Albert Speer termed Germany's most significant defeat. The Germans could not hit back. They had not appreciated the importance of the strategic bomber fleet until it was too late. Although Speer had dispersed arms manufacture, much of it was now driven underground. The Allied pounding of the marshalling yards and the destruction of Reichsbahn rolling stock created difficulties in deploying military hardware from the factories to the front line. Only in the east was it possible for the Germans to move around significant quantities of material, because like the Wehrmacht, the Soviets only possessed a tactical bomber force. In the west, a siege mentality set in. German mobility was radically undermined. Her armor could not be moved by day or night because of Allied fighters and diminishing stocks of fuel. The Luftwaffe was now irrelevant. American and British fighter bombers roamed the skies, hovering over German airfields, preventing the deployment of German aircraft. In the east, the Luftwaffe still enjoyed success. Much was made of the superlative efforts of Hans-Ulrich Rudel, who in his Junkers 87 tank cluster alone accounted for over 519 Soviet tanks. The most highly decorated man in the German armed forces, awarded the Knight's Cross with golden oak leaves, swords and diamonds, carried on flying, even after having had a foot amputated after being wounded in combat. Goebbels needed success stories like Rudel, but Nazi heroes were now thin on the ground. But at this time of emergency, Hitler retreated further from the public view. From the 16th of January 1945, he took up residency in Berlin, vowing never to leave. He incarcerated himself in the Spartan underworld of a bunker beneath the Chancellery in the heart of Berlin. Here, he moved the pawns of his diminishing divisions around the ever-retreating front lines. But if he was losing control of himself, his edicts were still followed on pain of disgrace or execution. Hitler's grip on reality was slipping, but his belief in his command genius was not. He gave a series of orders that served to shorten the life of the Reich. His favored method of defense in East and West was to create a series of Festungen or fortresses. The list of these fortified towns included Stettin, Königsberg, Tannenberg, and Breslau in the east, and La Rochelle and Rochefort in the west. They had little strategic value, but leached away German strength by isolating experienced troops who could have been better used in mobile warfare. The fate of these towns is best illustrated by the example of Breslau. In September of 1944, Hitler declared Breslau a fortress, which was to be part of the so-called Eastern Wall on the River Oder. Initial work on fortifying the city started as early as June 1944, but it was not until September that serious work began. The city was to be defended by creating 2 defensive rings and stockpiling supplies against a long-term siege. Numerous fortifications were built around the city in addition to 2 major walls. The defenses ran as far as 20 kilometers from the center of the city. The work was done by forced laborers, volunteers, women, children, and old men. The 80,000-strong garrison, under Gauleiter Karl Hanke and city commandant General Krause, later fired by Hanke because he wanted to evacuate the civilian population, was composed of a variety of units. They included the newly formed 609th Infantry Division, elements of the 269th Infantry Division, school and reserve units, improvised SS, 38 Volkssturm battalions, each 400 men strong, Hitler Jugend, police, Luftwaffe ground units, and remnants of destroyed combat formations. The defenders had 32 artillery batteries equipped with a mixture of old German and captured Soviet, Polish, Yugoslav, and Italian artillery pieces. The garrison had a handful of tanks and a company of 15 assault guns. In January of 1945, 50 Goliath demolition vehicles were delivered, along with 2 batteries of 75mm flak and 18 88mm flak guns. The garrison was supplied by air with supplies by the German Army and Red Cross, and was even reinforced with 2 specialist parachute battalions. Defense of Breslau was under overall command of Feldmarschall Schöner of Army Group Center. Soviet attacks began on the 8th of February, and from the beginning encountered heavy resistance from the 57th Panzer Corps, as well as counterattacks from the 19th and 20th Panzer Divisions. During the first 3 days of the battle, the Soviets lost 76 tanks and at least 100 in the next 2 weeks due to the wrong strategy. They used tanks, supported by assault groups in the street fighting. Soon the Soviets changed their tactics and began using artillery to destroy enemy positions, and engineers along with Marines to clear the enemy from the city. The high point of the battle came on the 13th of February when 19th Panzer Division desperately defended a fortified, the only link between the encircled city and the remainder of the German forces. At the same time, the 17th and 269th Infantry Divisions were ordered to break out in order to join other formations in the area. On the 16th of February, direct attacks on the city from the south and then from the west began. It rapidly turned into a bloody and savage fight for each house. The heaviest fighting took place in the area of the airbase and the industrial district of the city. On the night of the 13th of February, tanks from the 7th Guards Tank Corps closed the ring around the fortress with its garrison. In early March of 1945, German High Command attempted to break the encirclement by concentrating in the area of Gorlitz's 7 divisions, including 4 panzer divisions. The German attack began on March 3rd, and its main force fell on the weakened 3rd Guards Tank Army. After heavy fighting, the German attack was halted with heavy casualties. To strengthen the encirclement, General Gluzdowski's 6th Army, with an attached single division from 52nd Army, was moved into the area. In late March, the fate of Breslau was sealed as the last strong German formations southeast of Opel were destroyed. Fighting continued as Soviets pushed German defenders deeper into the city, who in turn destroyed every house and block behind them to slow down the advancing Soviets. After the loss of the air base on April the 1st, the Germans used the main street Kaiserstrasse as an airstrip and began to build a new one in the central part of the city. In order to do so, they leveled the area using forced labor. The large open space and construction work was soon discovered by the Soviets, who in turn began shelling the area using heavy artillery. The new airbase was never finished and never used. On May the 6th, 1945, the city commandant signed an act of conditional surrender, but none of the conditions were kept by the Soviets. 6,000 German soldiers and 170,000 civilians were killed, while 45,000 were taken prisoner. German military losses were higher, as numerous rescue planes were shot down and many evacuated wounded died behind the front lines. Soviet losses amounted to over 8,000 soldiers killed, including some 800 officers. On the 9th of May, Breslau was taken over by the Polish City Council, and on the 2nd of August, it became part of Poland. Incredibly, Hitler weakened the defenses on the Warsaw-Berlin axis in order to reinforce German forces in Hungary. General Guderian told Hitler that the Red Army massing against Germany's eastern defenses enjoyed overwhelming material superiority of 20-1 in artillery, 11-1 in infantry, and 7-1 in armor. Hitler refused to listen and told Guderian to sack his intelligence chief, to which Guderian retorted he might as well fire his chief of staff too. On the very day predicted by Guderian, the Russian offensive was launched. Marshal Konev's first Ukrainian front broke out of the Sandomierz bridgehead to tear a 35-kilometer hole in the German defenses in southern Poland. At the same time, the third Ukrainian front attacked East Prussia. 2 days later, Zhukov's first Belarusian front attacked from its bridgeheads over the Vistula and surrounded Warsaw. On the 17th of January 1945, the Polish capital, razed to the ground on Hitler's orders after the abortive rising the previous autumn, was taken by the First Polish Army. Krakow was liberated the next day. German units assembling for a counterattack at Lodz were caught deploying and swept back to the River Oder. East Prussia was cut off. The 3rd Panzer Army fell back into Königsberg and the Samland Peninsula. The beleaguered Germans were joined by the former garrison of Memel, evacuated on the 29th of January under the guns of the surviving units of the German Navy, including the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen. From the Baltic to southern Poland, improvised Kampfgruppen fought desperately, firstly to win time for German forces to make good their escape, and then to break free themselves. They took a huge toll on the advancing Soviet forces. They fought, as all soldiers do, for their unit rather than any notion of National Socialism. The gunners counted for wave after wave of Soviet army. Counterattack followed attack. The Ostier was going to go down fighting. But the Red Army advance was remorseless, progressing 400 kilometers in a fortnight to seize footholds on the west bank of the Oder. From there to Berlin, was but an hour's drive on the Autobahn. Hitler made his final broadcast to the German people on the 30th of January 1945, the 12th anniversary of his being appointed Chancellor of Germany. He exhorted his people to fight on.
Schwer auch die Krise im Augenblick sein mag, sie wird durch unseren unabänderlichen Willen, durch unsere Opferbereitschaft und durch unsere Fähigkeiten am Ende trotz alledem gemeistert werden. Wir werden auch diese Not überstehen. Es wird auch in diesem Kampf nicht Innerasien siegen, sondern Europa und an der Spitze jene Nation, die seit 1500 Jahren Europa als Vormacht gegen den Osten vertreten hat und in aller Zukunft vertreten wird, unser Großdeutsches Reich, die deutsche Nation.
The hot rake of war swept from the ancient Prussian heartland to Berlin itself. The Red Army smashed its way to the Nazi capital in what its historians termed the Vistula Oder operation, an object lesson in blitzkrieg that became a model for future Soviet war plans. Like the original German blitzkrieg into Russia in 1941, military expertise was combined with biblical savagery. This was a war of revenge. Russian propagandist Ilya Elin wrote, "Not only divisions and armies are advancing on Berlin, all the graves filled with corpses of the innocents are advancing on Berlin. The boots and shoes and baby slippers of those murdered, gassed at Majdanek are marching on Berlin. We shall forget nothing. As we advance through Pomerania, we have before our eyes the devastated, blood-drenched countryside of Belarusia." Meanwhile, the siege of Budapest continued. The last German attempt to relieve the city failed on the 1st of January 1945. Russian troops fought their way into the eastern half of the city, house by house, grinding their way to the Danube at incredible cost. The defenders were split into several pockets, which finally surrendered on the 18th of January. The same horrific process then began on the opposite bank as Buda was conquered, with the same combination of flamethrowers, explosive charges, and point-blank fire from self-propelled guns. Over 16,000 German and Hungarian troops tried to break out on the 16th of February once the end was near. They were wiped out in a series of running battles, and only a handful of individuals escaped to German lines. Hitler's last military offensive, Spring Awakening, began on the 6th of March at Lake Balaton, Hungary. A total of 31 divisions, including 11 Panzer and Panzer Grenadier divisions, took part, although all were substantially below authorized strength. The strike force included some 800 tanks, most in the 6th SS Panzer Army, commanded by SS Obergruppenführer Sepp Dietrich. Dietrich soon realized the assault was futile. The last strength of the Reich's battered armies had been squandered. It defies belief that Hitler could have ordered an attack in Hungary rather than defend his own people, who were in such desperate straits further to the north. 5 million German civilians fled to escape the Red Army. 2 million were evacuated by sea from German-held ports along the Baltic, noted for the worst maritime disaster in history, the sinking of the 25,000-ton liner Wilhelm Gustloff by a Soviet submarine. She had over 8,000 people aboard, of whom only 650 survived. Some 1.39 million German civilians remain unaccounted for. If some people reached safety but never advertised it, many more died hideous deaths at the hands of the more inventive members of the Red Army. When Roosevelt and Churchill met Stalin at the Crimean resort of Yalta in February 1945, they were not in the strongest of negotiating positions. The Soviets were rolling up the eastern borders of the Reich. Vienna was now within Stalin's grasp, the Germans having been completely driven from the Balkans. Konev and Rokossovsky's armies were poised to cross the last barrier before Berlin, the Oder. In the west, the Allies were stalled. Churchill could complain and posture, but the British Empire was bankrupt. He could do little to counter the ailing Roosevelt, who was determined to treat with Stalin as a man of honor. The West had still not learned how to negotiate with dictators. Stalin, at Yalta, was handed on a plate Soviet dominance of what came to be called the Eastern Bloc. In March, the Anglo-Americans prepared themselves for the final assault on Germany. 8 armies were aligned along the west bank of the Rhine. On the 23rd of March, the British 2nd and American 9th Armies operations, codenamed respectively Plunder and Grenade, were launched. These were spectacular affairs, involving large numbers of amphibious craft, massive air and artillery preparations, and the dropping of 2 airborne divisions behind the German defences on the east bank of the river. They were lightly opposed. Once through the initial lines of German defence, the Allied armour was free to sweep across the North German plain. The Allied Liberation Army now contained 85 divisions and numbered 4 million men, while the real strength of the German army in the West was only 26 divisions. The evolution of Eisenhower's plan in the West had already been changed by the fortuitous capture of the bridge at Remagen on the 7th of March. A catalogue of human error had led to its seizure. Hitler was furious, and several unfortunate officers were summarily shot. This position could not be immediately exploited, but on the 22nd of March, Patton's Third Army established another bridgehead after a surprise assault at Oppenheim. The German defences of the Rhine were therefore compromised at 2 widely separated places, in the Ruhr and at its confluence with the River Rhine at Mainz. This threatened the whole Wehrmacht position in the west, with envelopment on a large scale. This design was assisted by Hitler, who gave another of his disastrous stand-fast orders when German forces would have been better served by a withdrawal from the Ruhr pocket. While the British and Canadian armies pressed on into northern Germany, aiming towards Hamburg, the US 9th and 1st Armies proceeded to the Ruhr. Germany's industrial heartland was surrounded by the US 1st and 9th Armies on the 4th of April. The huge pocket contained the remnants of German Army Group B, together with elements of Army Group A's parachute units. It finally fell on the 18th of April, yielding 325,000 prisoners. The last few German units surrendered on the 21st of April. Model, the Führer's fireman, committed suicide. On the 13th of April, the Allies liberated Belsen and Buchenwald concentration camps, and Vienna fell to the Red Army. Nuremberg, the spiritual home of the Nazis, was captured by the US 7th Army on the 20th of April, while Dachau was liberated by the US Army on the 25th. On the evening of the 11th of April, the US 9th Army reached the River Elbe. This had been designated the previous year as the demarcation line between the Soviet and Western occupation zones in Germany. At Magdeburg, the 2nd Armored Division seized a bridgehead across the river. The next day, the 83rd Division established another at Barbie. Its soldiers thought they were going to Berlin. They were only 50 miles away after enlarging their bridgehead on the 14th of April. Orders quickly came down the line that they were not to press for the German capital, though had they moved immediately, Berlin would have fallen to the Americans and not the Russians. Eisenhower was bound by the inter-Allied agreement reinforced at Yalta. American forces in the central sector would stay where they were, while the British and Americans continued to clear northern Germany, and the southernmost US units and French armies overran Bavaria. The Red Army deserved the prize of Berlin. They needed to redeem the countless atrocities committed on their own people by the invaders. The capture of Berlin represented psychological completion. Had Eisenhower not ceded the German capital to the Russians, and with it most of eastern Germany, he might have provoked a third world war. Among his armies, there were many hot-blooded generals who disagreed. They thought that, whilst they were in Europe to get rid of one dictator, they might as well take the opportunity to rid the world of the communist dictator Stalin as well. Alarmed at the progress of the Anglo-American forces, Stalin ordered his top commanders to race each other to Berlin, the lair of the fascist beast. He deliberately refused to agree unit boundaries between Koniev and Suffolk. The Russians made intensive preparations for the final attack. They still believed that the Germans had the ability to counterattack in strength, and wanted to leave nothing to chance. The two rival commanders had between them 1,640,000 men, with 41,600 guns and mortars, 6,300 tanks, and the support of 3 air armies and 8,400 aircraft. Facing them were 7 panzer divisions and 65 infantry divisions in some sort of order. There were also 100 independent battalions, formed for the most part from remnants of obliterated divisions. The force was given the grandiloquent name of Army Group Vistula and was entrusted to the command of General Heinrichy. At dawn, on the 16th of April, a tremendous artillery and air bombardment opened along the Oder and Neisse rivers. Out of the Soviet bridgeheads stormed the first waves of shock troops. There was no finesse in these massed attacks. The Russian artillery was arranged wheel to wheel in a row and thundered away for hours in a massive preliminary barrage. When the shelling halted, the tanks moved forward. The T-34s lumbered from their hides. They carried with them the descent infantry squads riding on their hulls. Konyev's troops stormed the river Neisse under the cover of 2,000 Soviet aircraft. 60-ton bridges were in position that afternoon, and his tanks were ready to exploit the territory all the way to the Spree. Zhukov's attack faltered, the intensity of his artillery barrage notwithstanding. Zhukov allowed impatience to overcome his military judgment, and ordered both his tank armies to attack without waiting for the infantry to break into the defenses. Zhukov could override both his battle plan and his infantry commanders, but even the indomitable marshal could not command the Germans to give in. The German anti-tank guns commenced a frightful slaughter of Soviet armor as the vehicles struggled across the swampy plain below. When the tanks fought their way onto the German position, they found themselves among minefields and were attacked by infantry teams with Panzerfausts. Zhukov's men stormed the Zelo Heights, the last major barrier before Berlin, after 800 aircraft bombed the enemy defenses, and the gunners unleashed another formidable concentration of fire. However, Konyev's tanks had not only reached the river Spree, but his T-34s drove straight into the river where an old map marked a ford. Under fire all the way, they roared across and quickly established a bridgehead on the opposite bank. Berlin lay waiting. Konyev's tanks raced north, where Rybalko's 3rd Guards Tank Army joined Petrukov's 1st Guards Tank Army, part of Zhukov's front. By the 19th of April, Zhukov had advanced 20 miles on a 40-mile wide front. As they moved irresistibly forward, they annihilated the bulk of the German 9th Army, immobilized in their path by a lack of fuel. On April the 20th, the Führer celebrated his 56th birthday. Among his visitors was the pioneering aviatrix Anna Reich, who evaded Soviet fighters and AA fire and landed on the Charlottenburger Strasse near the bunker. The last pictures showing Hitler alive were taken at the Führer bunker and show him congratulating a line of youthful Hitler Jugend soldiers, awarding each with an Iron Cross for their defense of the Reich's capital. On April the 12th, 1945, Adolf Hitler heard the news of the death of the US President Franklin Roosevelt. Dr. Joseph Goebbels, the sinister Reichsminister für Volkserklärung und Propaganda, Reich Minister for Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, was ecstatic and signaled, "My Führer, I congratulate you. Roosevelt is dead. It is written in the stars that the second half of April will be the turning point for us." The Führer was now so far removed from reality that he and his propaganda minister were putting their faith in astrologists. On the morning of the 21st of April, Zhukov's tanks entered the northern suburbs, and the units following them were regrouped for siege warfare. Zhuikov, who had fought the Battle of Stalingrad, knew what was necessary. Assault groups were formed from a company of infantry supported by half a dozen anti-tank guns, a troop of tank or assault guns, a couple of engineer platoons, and a flamethrower platoon. According to the theory of siege warfare, assault weapons were used to blast or burn down resistance in the city blocks, into which the infantry then attacked. Overhead, the heavy artillery and rocket launchers fired crushing salvos to prepare the way for the next stage, house-to-house fighting. Medical teams stood close by. Street fighting produces exceptionally heavy casualties, not only from gunshot at short range, but also from collapsing buildings. On April the 23rd, Secretary Martin Bormann and Joseph Goebbels appealed to the population of Berlin to persevere. As Gauleiter Goebbels broadcast, "I call on you to fight for your city. Fight with everything you have got, for the sake of your wives and your children, your mothers and your parents. Your arms are defending everything we have ever held dear, and all the generations that will come after us. Be proud, courageous, be inventive and cunning. Your Gauleiter is amongst you. He and his colleagues will remain in your midst. His wife and children are here as well. He, who once captured the city with 200 men, will now use every means to galvanize the defense of the capital. The battle for Berlin must become the signal for the whole nation to rise up in battle." Slogans were painted on walls to raise morale and encourage resistance. One coined by Joseph Goebbels was a triumph of optimism over reality. Berlin bleibt Deutsch. Berlin stays German. On April the 25th, the fronts of Zuchwalf and Koniew linked up east of Ketzin, near Potsdam, west of Berlin, and the city was surrounded. Trapped inside it was the garrison of 200,000, and a pocket with about the same number from the 9th Army and 4th Panzer Army to the south and east of the city. Berlin, already badly damaged by RAF raids, the last on April the 21st, followed by a United States Army Air Force attack, would be fought for, street by street, from the suburbs to the Reichstag in the center. The canals, U-Bahn, subway, and vast stone-built apartments and public buildings with cellars were ideal for street fighting. The outermost belt of the concentric defenses was about 32 kilometers from the city center. The next 16 kilometers, the S-Bahn suburban railway, served as a defense. Finally, in the center was the Z Citadel, the citadel with the government offices and the Führer bunker, the two-story concrete bunker by the Reich Chancellery, where Hitler was now living a troglodyte life. From his bunker, Hitler continued issuing orders to his diminishing army. He urged on a relief attack by the 12th Army under General Walter Wenck on the Elbe front. The 12th Army consisted of 12 divisions, recently formed from a mixture of veterans, disbanded units, and newly trained conscripts. Their attack began on the 26th of April and reached within 30 kilometers of Berlin. But after 2 days of hard fighting, the Germans were ground to a halt. For the embattled 9th Army, Wenck's attack was the only escape route from the Soviet trap, and they continued to fight westwards until April the 29th. On the 26th of April, 464,000 Soviet troops, supported by 12,700 guns, 21,000 rocket launchers, and 1,500 tanks, ringed the inner city. The Soviets massed artillery at a density of 650 guns per kilometer, virtually wheel to wheel. As the finale began, a pall of smoke from burning buildings and the heat of combat rose 1,000 feet above Berlin. The area of the city, still in German hands, had been reduced to a strip some 10 miles long and 3 miles wide. Early on the 29th of April, the fighting was less than a quarter of a mile away from the Reich Chancellery, which had been demolished by heavy Russian shells. 55 feet beneath the surface, Hitler exercised what little authority remained to him. He appointed Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz his successor as Führer. He dismissed Albert Speer for refusal to carry out his orders to turn Germany into a wasteland. He expelled Himmler and Goering from the Nazi Party for acts of treason. He appointed Ritter von Greim as Chief of the Air Force. He married his longtime mistress, Eva Braun, and finally dictated his last will and political testament. This was a final piece of callous invective, carrying the poison of hatred and insight to murder. I charge the leadership of the nation and their subjects with the meticulous observance of the race laws and the merciless resistance to the universal prisoner of all peoples, international jury. Hitler committed suicide at around 3 o'clock on the 30th of April. Above him, the fight for the Reichstag was reaching its climax. The building was brought under the direct fire of 89 Russian heavy guns of 152mm and 203mm caliber. At 2 o'clock, men of Zhukov's Third Shock Army had raised the Soviet banner on the second floor of the building. But the German garrison of the building was still fighting on. The battle for the Reichstag raged on all afternoon until late into the evening. 2 Red Army men of the 1st Battalion of the 756th Regiment hoisted the victory banner on the Reichstag's dome. Inside the bunker, the deluded Goebbels and Bormann made approaches to the Soviets for a ceasefire. They believed that they could parley for terms other than unconditional surrender. The Soviets refused to negotiate, and at 6:30 p.m. on the 1st of May, every Soviet gun and rocket launcher opened fire on the remaining pocket resistance. 2 hours previously, Goebbels and his wife, who had just poisoned their 6 children, ordered an SS guard to shoot them in the Chancery Garden close to Hitler's grave. Their bodies were only partially burned and buried in a shallow grave. Soviet troops had little difficulty in identifying the corpses when they entered the Chancery Garden next day. At 3 p.m. on May the 2nd, General Karl Weidling, the commandant of the Berlin garrison, instructed it to surrender, and about 136,000 men marched into captivity. They left in the tomb of the Reich the bodies of about 125,000 Berliners who had died in the siege, many by suicide. The cost to the Red Army had also been terrible. Between the 16th of April and the 8th of May, the Zhukov, Konev, and Rokossovsky's fronts had lost 304,887 men killed, wounded, and missing, 10% of its strength, and the heaviest casualty list suffered by the Red Army in any battle of the war. Now the war in Europe was almost over. A local armistice had been arranged in Italy and took effect on the 2nd of May. On the 3rd of May, Admiral Hans von Friedeberg surrendered the German forces in Denmark, Holland, and North Germany to Montgomery. On the 7th of May, Jodl signed a general surrender of German forces at Eisenhower's headquarters at Rheims in France. Stalin was outraged. He wanted the final surrender to be made in Berlin. Accordingly, the next day, Feldmarschall Keitel, his arrogance seemingly untroubled by defeat, Marshal Georgy Zhukov, and British Air Marshal Tedder signed a second unconditional surrender. The war in Europe was at an end.